Although we're in a crisis status, we're treating it differently because the emergency still exists. We can look at long-term planning. We're not using this as an emergency, but we are managing it differently.
Challenges in migrant sheltering. New York City's recent implementation of shelter stay limits for migrant families has come under scrutiny, with Comptroller Brad Lander criticizing the rollout as haphazard and lacking in adequate policies or effective case management. The policy, announced by Mayor Adams in October, imposed a 60-day limit on how long migrant families could stay in shelters due to an influx of asylum seekers straining the city's shelter system. However, the policy was met with immediate criticism from city workers, experts, and elected officials who deemed it counterproductive for families trying to adjust to life in New York. At a press conference held outside the Row, a hotel-turned-emergency migrant shelter, Lander emphasized concerns not only about the underlying values of the policy, but also about its chaotic implementation. He highlighted that the implementation lacked coherence, failed to meet its own goals and standards, didn't provide written policies to staff and contractors, and failed to track outcomes in any meaningful way.
You're not going to see some of those draconian steps that we were going to have to take. When we inherited this, we were in an emergency state. Well, if we had to do the third rounds, it would impact garbage pickup. That's getting in the way of the cleanliness and the safety of our city. We're now transitioning into a stabilized state, a series of services that you will actually see the difference.
According to a recent analysis by the Comptroller's Office, by the end of last month, over 10,200 families with children had received notices to vacate their shelters. Among this group, more than half exited the city's care entirely, while 40% relocated to other shelters, and 9% remained in their current shelters. Notably, some families from the last cohort opted to reside in an emergency tent shelter at Floyd Bennett Field, located in a remote part of Brooklyn. Lisa Schwartzwald, who directs family advocacy at the New York Immigration Coalition, expressed concern over the situation, stating, "We are seeing parents choosing to live with their children in a field rather than continue to be shuffled from shelter to shelter throughout the city." This series of events underscores several key issues surrounding the implementation of shelter stay limits for migrant families in New York City. Firstly, the policy itself has faced criticism for its potentially harmful impact on migrant families. By imposing strict time limits on shelter stays, the policy risks exacerbating the already challenging circumstances faced by vulnerable migrant populations, including limited access to housing and resources, as well as the stress of adjusting to life in a new city. Secondly, the haphazard implementation of the policy has further compounded these challenges. Without clear policies and effective case management procedures in place, there is a risk of confusion and inconsistency in how the policy is applied, potentially leading to unjust outcomes for migrant families. Thirdly, the lack of comprehensive tracking and evaluation mechanisms makes it difficult to assess the effectiveness of the policy and its impact on migrant families accurately. Without data on outcomes such as housing stability, access to services, and overall well-being, it is challenging to determine whether the policy is achieving its intended goals or if adjustments are needed to better support migrant families. Moving forward, there is a need for a more thoughtful and compassionate approach to addressing the housing needs of migrant families in New York City. This includes developing policies that prioritize stability and support for families as they navigate the challenges of resettlement, as well as implementing robust case management systems to ensure that families receive the assistance and resources they need to thrive. Additionally, greater transparency and accountability in the implementation of such policies are essential to ensure that they are applied fairly and equitably across all affected populations. This includes providing clear guidelines to staff and contractors involved in implementing the policy, as well as regularly monitoring and evaluating outcomes to identify areas for improvement. Critical analysis. The implementation of New York City's migrant shelter policy, initiated on January 9th, was accompanied by assurances of intensive case management aimed at facilitating the transition of families with children towards self-sufficiency. However, a recent audit, based on city-provided materials, has revealed significant shortcomings in the delivery of these services, casting doubt on the policy's effectiveness in achieving its stated objectives. According to the Comptroller's Office, the scope of case management services provided to migrant families was found to be limited, offering little in terms of tangible assistance towards achieving self-sufficiency. Instead of prioritizing stable housing solutions, the emphasis was primarily on securing placements for families outside the shelter system, preferably beyond the confines of New York City. This approach, while potentially alleviating immediate shelter pressures, fails to address the long-term housing stability needs of vulnerable migrant families. Despite assurances from Mayor Adams' spokeswoman, Kayla Mamalak, regarding ongoing efforts to improve implementation through updated training and guidance for staff, the audit findings underscore a pressing need for substantive reforms in the city's approach to migrant sheltering. The analysis further highlights deficiencies in communication and procedural transparency within the shelter system. Written notices provided to families lack crucial information regarding exemptions, such as those for pregnant women and reasonable accommodation measures. Specific blackout dates, governing periods where families cannot be displaced from shelters, were found to be outdated, posing logistical challenges for affected families. Monica Sibri, an organizer with Al Gundia, noted the detrimental impact of frequent shelter transitions on families, citing instances where individuals lost track of their belongings and encountered difficulties in accessing essential services. The lack of clarity surrounding processes for retaining belongings and updating mailing addresses exacerbates the vulnerability of migrant families, particularly those navigating the asylum application process or seeking work authorization. The investigation, endorsed by City Council Speaker Adrienne Adams, represents a significant step towards addressing systemic deficiencies in the city's migrant sheltering policies. Adams emphasized the potential of the audit findings to inform more effective policy solutions, signaling a collaborative approach towards reform within city governance structures. A separate analysis conducted by the City Council revealed concerning trends regarding educational disruptions among children evicted from migrant shelters. Nearly 1 in 5 children affected by shelter evictions were found to no longer be enrolled in the same schools, raising concerns about the potential long-term impacts on their academic progress and linguistic development. Research indicates that students in temporary housing who experience school disruptions, particularly non-native English speakers, are at heightened risk of chronic absenteeism and delayed language acquisition. Against the backdrop of a steadily increasing migrant population, with over 195,000 individuals passing through the city's care in the past 2 years alone, the urgency of addressing systemic shortcomings in the shelter system cannot be overstated. With approximately 65,600 individuals still reliant on the shelter system and ongoing daily arrivals, the strain on existing resources underscores the need for comprehensive and sustainable solutions. While the issuance of 30- and 60-day notices may serve as a temporary measure to mitigate shelter pressures, it is imperative that such actions are accompanied by robust support mechanisms and a concerted push for increased federal assistance. Mayor Adams' call for greater federal support echoes a broader recognition of the multifaceted challenges facing migrant communities and underscores the need for collaborative action at all levels of government. Exploring policy solutions. The current migrant crisis in New York City has reached unprecedented levels, with the city experiencing a surge in arrivals since spring 2022. Over 118,000 migrants and asylum seekers, predominantly from Latin American and Caribbean countries, have crossed the U.S.-Mexico border and sought refuge within the city. While New York has historically welcomed tens of thousands of new arrivals each year, the recent influx has placed immense strain on city services, particularly the shelter system. Despite the city's prior experience in accommodating foreign migrants, the scale of the current crisis has posed significant challenges. Unlike previous waves of migration, today's arrivals often come with limited resources and rely heavily on the city's shelter system for accommodation. As of September, nearly 60,000 newly arrived migrants were living in shelters, with approximately 2/3 comprising families with children.
Really, my number one goal of preventing that from happening.
That we cannot continue to be paying for unlimited hotel rooms for people.
No child and no family will sleep on the streets.
They stay overnight and then they leave the next morning.
Tents all over the cities. I don't want that to turn into our city.
That these congregate settings are the way to go. We're opening one here today at Floyd Bennett Field. And
the fiscal burden of supporting these migrants has been substantial, exceeding $1 billion thus far, and prompting city officials to declare a state of emergency. One of the primary challenges faced by migrants in New York City is accessing legal services for asylum applications. Due to lengthy processing times, individuals applying for asylum must wait a minimum of 6 months before receiving a work permit. However, many migrants struggle to find legal representation to initiate the asylum process, leaving them unable to work legally or access essential services. This issue is exacerbated by the backlog of asylum cases in immigration courts, where wait times can span several years. The migrant crisis in New York City is shaped by various regional factors within Latin America. Political and economic instability in countries such as Venezuela, Haiti, and Cuba has driven millions of people to flee their homelands in search of safety and opportunity. Additionally, factors such as inequality, violence, and climate change-related disasters have contributed to the migration flow. While the majority of migrants initially resettled within the region, growing awareness of economic opportunities and labor shortages in the U.S. has led to an increase in migration northward. Policy responses to the migrant crisis have been multifaceted, but have yet to fully address the underlying challenges. While the Biden administration has expanded temporary protected status for certain migrant groups, long-term solutions require legislative action from Congress. Proposed policy options include reducing the waiting period for asylum seekers to apply for work permits and streamlining the asylum application process to alleviate bureaucratic delays. Additionally, there is a need for increased funding and staffing for immigration agencies to address the backlog of asylum cases and expedite processing. Political divisions within the U.S. have further complicated efforts to address the migrant crisis. Debates over immigration reform have stagnated, with Republicans accusing Democrats of promoting open borders, while Democrats grapple with internal disagreements over border policy. The upcoming 2024 presidential election adds another layer of complexity, with both parties using the crisis as a political tool to rally support among their base. That's all for today, folks. We'll see you another time.